being here. Thank you, David and Claire and colleagues, for this invitation and for what for me has been a wonderful conference so far. I've been wanting to behave in an unsophisticated way myself. I've been wanting to cheer all my way through the day as people have said things that make me feel so at home, and I've sat through some really exciting provocations on disability narrative from Anna Bay and Ella and Sumaira. I really wanted to cheer at those, and I wanted to cheer also at the powerful illustration of the potential of dancing knowledge and the way in which we can know differently through disability. But I've behaved myself so far, and I just need to get through the next bit. Susan Sarandon, the writer, went to Sarajevo at its war-torn worst and asked what she could do to help. The response was, you could write us a play. I'm going to talk about two particular troubles we have in education, which I think need the arts to get them out of it. The first trouble is school-related, and is what I'm suggesting is a crisis in inclusion, whereby teachers are finding diversity so difficult that they feel inclusion is an impossibility, and it's leading to what Sally Tomlinson, the sociologist, has called an irresistible rise of the SEN industry. The second trouble I want to talk about relates to higher education, and is what A.H. Halsey has called a Donish decline, whereby academics are feeling so pulled and stretched with performativity that they can't be inclusive and they can't engage with all their students as they would wish. I want to suggest that the arts can bring us ways of feeling better, feeling well in these educational contexts, and can help us to think about how we might play seriously. And I'm going to turn on the camera. Sorry. That did look like a bit performative. You wanted to be in it. She's my fan. This is a bit of how you're making a Julie. Sorry about that. Sorry, okay, it's just you can rove. I can rove. I'm sorry. That's what you told me. I think it's on. Is it on? You just click down. Oh, sorry. Can you dance over again? No! I'm now! It's on. It's got a light on. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, but yeah. Or should I try to stay put? If anyone wants to dance across, feel free. That's great. I want to suggest three spaces in which we might play. And these are the ontological, which are to do with reorienting ourselves towards ethics, the aesthetic, and there I want to argue that we can try to confound, using the arts, three sets of people: children and young people, the public through disability arts, and lastly, the academics who are having such a pitiful time. I'll start with the inclusion crisis, and it does seem to me not to be overstating it to call it a crisis, which is provoked by a number of pressures of performativity. The first of which is what Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist, refers to as a tyranny of transparency. The emphasis on constantly proving that you're doing well in education rather than improving. And Stephen Ball suggests this leads to a fabrication of success. Teachers I've spoken to have described their confusion over what inclusion is supposed to be, frustration that it's not reaching the people they want to engage with, exhaustion, it's too much, and guilt that they're letting down children and families. And some of that intensity is supplemented by what various teacher unions have referred to as a collision course between the ambitions to test everyone, high stakes testing, and inclusion. And even our dear Mary Warner, who started much of this many years ago, has come out and said, I changed my mind. It's actually a really bad idea to have all children educated together. And she's also incidentally been recommending euthanasia for your grannies, so she's not really to be trusted. The arenas in which school inclusion function are really not helping matters. And we have a system whereby policy is simply being adhered to rather than critiqued. We're all facing the new code of practice for special educational needs with fear and trepidation about how we will conform and be compliant, rather than asking, how is this helping us or not? And the resources for teachers make things worse, because they present inclusion as this destination to get to. I have an image up here of a real sign in a real school, given as a present from a PhD student whose thesis I examined. And she picked up me saying, inclusion isn't a destination. She said, yes it is. Business, ICT, and sports. But we have resources that model and metaphor that journey towards some end point. Pathways to inclusion from Europe. The Inclusion Index. Some of my best friends wrote the Inclusion Index, and it's terrible. And disability gets commatized, as Stephen Ball says, after race, disadvantage, gender. So we have it as an add-on, and none of the kind of intersectional understanding that we need. And a more serious problem comes from what David Bolt, behind me, has called critical avoidance. And he developed this in relation to encounters between disabled and non-disabled individuals. But it is escalating in his mind, and as I see it, right through to an institutional level, where there are structures and processes that are about critical avoidance. And we heard from Rebecca and Sumera today about institutionally how things close down in order to stop you challenging inequalities. All of this ensures that we lose sight of what matters. And it's leading to what Sally Tomlinson, a sociologist who wrote in the 80s about the rise in special education, is becoming worse. She refers to an expanded and expensive special needs industry, and she wrote this in 2012. She says it's irresistible and arises from a continued need for resourcing on the basis of diagnosis. Parents seeking diagnoses. Teachers under pressure to improve attainment, seeking to take children out of classroom. And an expanding number of professionals needing to keep their jobs, retain their client base. And this is expanding at a rate that's quite terrifying when we think about children with behavioural problems. They're now being diagnosed at an alarming rate. And you have here a picture that I'm delighted to describe, because it's a Scottish one. Well, it was in the private eye. We have this lovable rogue who used to be known as Dennis the Menace. And he was always hitting people with his slingshot, getting into trouble, and we all loved him in the Sunday Post. He's now sitting back in the armchair, slingshot abandoned. He's now Dennis the Medicated.
Oh, Dennis the Medicated.
Thank you.
Just turn over.
I know. It doesn't usually translate from Scotland, but and we had Kay this afternoon showing the discontents of the social model of disability, and I was really happy to hear that. Where's Kay? Sort of coming in, there she is. And brilliantly drawing attention to some of the trouble with the social model, which was supposed to help us think differently about disability, to think away from deficit-oriented notions of children's difficulties. And it didn't work. And I have here a quote from Mike Oliver, who spoke in a book that Roger Slee and I wrote together, about his utter disappointment with what we've done with the social model. He says, I'm not being falsely modest. I'm not saying the disability politics book or the social work book hasn't had some influence, but somehow it's not enough. The vast majority of disabled people still have pretty shitty lives. I think the work around the social model has influenced a whole generation of professionals. On my good days, I think it has influenced for the better. But on my bad days, I think all it has done is actually taught a whole new generation of professionals a different language, a different way of talking about the world. The more I think about that, the more I think, and go and read the Racing Post and see if you can figure out who's going to win the 2:30. Because on bad days, it's why are we doing it? Why don't we do something else? And there's an image there of Bill Shannon, who works with the social model and goes out into the streets of America with his crutches or skateboard and tries to turn the voyeuristic gaze back on able-bodied people and films them making a fool of themselves as they try to help him. It's quite troubling artwork, but he is playing with the social model. But Mike has gone from academia, a disappointed man, and we tried to say it's not so bad. But if you talk to academics, they will see it's terrible, it's awful. And they will complain about what A.H. Halsey, admittedly writing initially in the 90s, called a decline of the Donish dominion. We're losing our academics, they're losing their capacity to be intellectuals. And the picture accompanying that is Edvard Munch's The Scream. Academics are feeling undermined, overwhelmed, and not being able to be the kind of intellectuals that Frank Furedi is searching for. Bruno Latour has added to this critique and suggested that we've run out of steam. We're not able to be critical. And I think this is quite serious. Latour paints the academics as like the Duracell batteried doll, constantly repeating the same mistakes, just stuck in the headlights. I think it is a rabbit, and not able to meet the new threats, the new dangers, the new tasks, and the new targets we face. But it's a little bit hard to get sympathy for academics because they are quite well paid, and it is a rather nice job. But I've included this account from A.H. Halsey, who talks about academics being a kind of odd species, and they are. Academicus superciliosus. And he talks about the behaviour patterns of one of the true members of the species are unmistakable. He's inflated with self-esteem, perpetually self-congratulatory as to the high vocation of the university teacher, but he knows almost nothing about any other vocation. And he will lie down and let himself be walked over if anyone else enters the outer world, from the outer world, who has money or power or even a touchline in realist talk. Superciliosus is the most divisible and reliable creature in this country, being so intent upon crafty calculations of short-term advantages. This favour for his department, that, a colleague who next week at the next committee has promised to run a log for him, but he has never even tried to imagine the wood out of which his timber rolls. He can scurry furiously and self-importantly around in his committees like a white mouse running in a wheel while his master is carrying in cage and all to be sold at the local pet shop. Zizek, writing more recently, is no more positive, referring to academics as being among the prattling classes and journalists with no specialist education, usually working in humanities with some vague French postmodern leanings, specialists in everything, prone to verbal radicalism, in love with paradoxical formulations that flatly contradict the obvious.
Is this a bad thing?
It's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. It's a very bad thing, and I think it's very bad of them to say that about us, you and those of us who earn our living that way. But I think there is a serious problem with being an academic engaged in the field of disability. And one aspect of that is outlined by Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher, who says, we're getting ourselves confused. Academics are getting ourselves confused. And we're committing the error of emotivism. And he says emotivism is a confusion about the answer to the question, why should I do? The two answers that are possible, he says, are one, because I wish it, an answer that's personal to me, and two, because it is your duty. And MacIntyre suggests that we get the two mixed up, and we say of things like inclusion, why should I do it? Because I wish it, and you should do it. It's a confusion that is unhelpful. And to be fair, this may arise from the emphasis on performativity that I alluded to earlier, and the what works mentality that is driving our research, funding, and practice. And it's a mentality which Gregorio has suggested threatens to totalize experience, to reduce language to newspeak. It's the demand for reality, unity, simplicity, communicability, and remedy. Remedy for the parcelling and virtualization of culture, for the fragmentation of the life world and the derealization into idioms, pétébési, and language games. Claire Colebrook has suggested that it's making us stupid. It's making us engage without thinking. And as a result, there's malevolence and stupidity that go beyond error. Edward Said has suggested that our biggest threat is coming from professionalism. That practice that isn't coming from the academy or the suburbs or from journalism or publishing, but from professionalism. And he means by professionalism something you do between the hours of 9 and 5, looking at the clock and thinking about what is considered to be proper professional behaviour. Engaging without rocking the boat, without straying outside limits, and making yourself marketable, presentable, uncontroversial, unpolitical, and objective. And it was interesting, Rebecca and Sumaira were talking about how, and in the context of trying to introduce more equitable assessment, equity gets used against the practices, and that's shrouded in a kind of professionalism, but it closes down any possibility of thinking otherwise. And the consequences of doing without this level of thinking, without this level of criticality, are really rather dire. And Bernstein helpfully takes us through those consequences by distinguishing between two discourses that operate within education, the horizontal and the vertical. Bernstein says the horizontal discourses are the ones where we talk about know-how. They're tacit, oral, and contextual. We describe how we teach in this way or that. The vertical discourses are the scientific know-why discourses of knowledge. And it's the latter that are being eroded in favour of the former, of the quick fix, of the what works, of the tell me what to do. And many writers across the globe, Christine Sleater, Michael Apple, and Alex Anderson from Sweden, and many others, are saying that we're losing the vertical discourses, and we're losing, as a result, our capacity to make equitable judgments. And I'm adding that we're losing sight of the other. And Julian Critchley, citing Derrida, says we end up with injustice. And he says injustice, not to mention racism, nationalism, and imperialism, begins when one loses sight of the transcendence of the other and forgets that the state, with its institutions, is informed by the proximity of my relation to the other. So, what do? Well, let's play. Let's fail first of all. Samuel Beckett asks us, ever tried? Ever failed? No matter. Try again. Fail again. Fail better. And there's a suggestion there to step out of the what works mentality and the shackles of effectiveness, doing better, and recognizing that failing might be something we can engage with. And we might become a different kind of academic species, that of Homo scholasticus or Homo academicus, someone who, in Bourdieu's words, can play seriously because he's allowed to do so. The state allows him free time outside a practical situation. And I want to suggest that we can play in 3 spaces. Now I have here an image of a child who might be described as giving the finger. It's not my child. But the invitation here is to play in the first of 3 spaces, which is the ontological space. And so to return to the question, what should I do? The first answer is, what can I do? And also, why should I do it, inclusion? Well, because I wish it, and because it is my duty, not yours, but mine. So playing seriously with ontology involves actually facing up to power, and I'm going to keep coming back to power, but facing up to it in unromantic ways, being subversive, and being counter-hegemonic. So playing in an ontological space is an ethical response. It's an ethical response that starts with the disappointment in letting down the other, in forgetting the other. It starts with that disappointment, that feeling and experience of failure, and takes back the responsibility for the other. In Levinas's terms, it's an ethics because it's reconnecting with human subjectivity. And it's recognizing that that responsibility to the other is absolute. Levinas says that responsibility can be overwhelming at times. It can force us it can persecute us, rather, with its weight and with the needs of the other. But it's nevertheless possible to provoke, with that responsibility, a series of ethical duties. And these ethical duties are for us as academics to try to engage with the articulation of new political subjectivities, trying to name the other, as Rancière calls it, making a discourse of that which was a noise. So constantly reinforcing the language of the other. And tied to that, I would suggest, is trying to enforce a language of civil disobedience. And Plato helpfully gives us the notion of the gadfly. A ludicrous figure of speech, he admits, but I am a gadfly, given to the state by God, and the state is a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has attached to the state, and all day long and in all places, I'm always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. You will not easily find another like me, and therefore I would advise you to spare me. So we might be academics who are gadflies. To move into the second space, which is the aesthetic, we might try to think about how the arts can help us to confound the three groups I mentioned. Children and young people, the public, and those troubled academics. She says, distancing herself. The arts, as I've already had affirmed from me today, are just magical. They are capable of giving us not effects, but affects, which are sensory, which are sensual, and which are felt. They can produce fragments, using Deleuze's words, strivings, illusions, investigations, and in Bredotti's words, can give us fabulations, little fictions that are capable of taking us into a new world in that fiction, a new world that we don't know. They're literally capable of taking the ground away from us. And Deleuze and Guattari warns us that although the arts are so enlivening and so capable of affording us these affects, they are very fragile and they are ready to be closed down by everyone else. He says people are constantly putting up an umbrella that shelters them, and on the underside of which they draw a firmament and write their conventions and opinions. But poets, artists make a slit in the umbrella. They tear open the firmament itself to let in a bit of free and windy chaos, and to frame in a sudden light a vision that appears through the vent. Wordsworth's Spring, Cézanne's Apple, the silhouettes of Macbeth or Allan. Then come the crowd of imitators who repair the umbrella with something vaguely resembling the vision, and a crowd of commentators who patch over the vent with opinions. And thinking about the children and young people first, Anthony Minghella, a filmmaker who has sadly died, spoke to a group of teachers and art educators once and told a story of how his own teacher had confounded him by playing Leonard Cohen songs to him. Wouldn't do it for me, but it gave to him a love of poetry that he sustained every day. So he read poetry every day because of Suzanne, the Leonard Cohen song. And he said, he almost shouted at us. He said, teachers, you must confound children, not bore them, and help them to think about the different narratives, the conscious, what I think I'm doing, the secret, what I know about how I'm doing, and the unconscious, what I don't know I'm doing. And for children, the arts are kind of easy. They get it. They do the arts naturally. They're constantly exploring, investigating, drawing up maps. In its own way, says Deleuze, art says what children say. It's made up of trajectories and becomings, and it too makes maps, both extensive and intensive. And I want to mention a little experiment we had with some children and with the arts. And we wanted to see if we could engage them in the kind of embodied and rhizomic learning that Deleuze and others talk about the arts as affording. And we set up a thing called Art Lab, and we got various artists to come and give a group of children of all abilities, all diversities, to come and spend the day in an art centre. And we wanted to see how they would do, see how they reflected on it in comparison with their school experience. And we have here a picture which shows a group of children being led by a disabled actor called Robert Softley, who is with Birds of Paradise and is doing some really wonderful work now. He took this group of youngsters through improvisation sessions. He came out of his wheelchair at points and had them making things up with punctuation. So they were saying things and moving. Afterwards, reflecting on the experience, they couldn't remember that Robert was disabled. They referred to his machine thing that he had come out of, because the machine thing became used as part of the improvisation. So they were reflecting on a very embodied and rhizomic learning experience. A second activity was a science lesson in magnetism involving dance, and it provoked much contrast with school activities. You don't have to do, you didn't have to do work, you just got to do the fun stuff. Some said it's work, but it's fun work. So they were struck by the contrast between how they were engaging in arts and how different it was from the mundane school life they lived. And this third example shows Matt with the hat. who for these children was the embodiment of the perfect teacher. Because Matt with the hat said, "I'm Matt." And got the kids to just make music. And he said to them, "You don't need a drum to make good rhythm. You've got lots of bodily surfaces. This is a drumming class, let's face it, it's not physics. It's drum. And as a researcher, I was standing there, the teachers were all standing there, the children who started like this were, and we were all pulsing and throbbing and loving it. And the big grin on these children's faces just said it all. They were making art, and they were being included. So for me, that really showed how we could confound youngsters to engage and be included. Turning to the public and the possibility of arts to confound this lot, I want to draw on some disability arts as means of taking ideology, the ideology that constructs people in stuck binarisms and plays with it. And it's quite wonderful how it can strategically deploy difference in order to make a difference, to make a political difference. Famously, Nancy Meyers describes herself as a cripple who swaggers. And the work of the disability artists is about challenging that invisibility or that presumed absence of sexuality or personality visited on disabled people. And for me, it aligns with a kind of cynicism which Sloterdijk, a German writing about, described as cynicism, a form of, not cynicism, but a kind of laughing, or in his words, hissing in the idealist wind, laughing in the face of impudent demands of such morose societies. And Sloterdijk wrote a philosophy book that became popular among Germans. It's kind of interesting. But he tells the tale of the good soldier Schweik, who constantly comes up against stupid people, his officers, and says, and annoys them further. A couple of examples just to heighten the power of disability arts work, and the first comes from poetry. I don't want to live in bungalow land on the outer edges of the urban sprawl, in the places designed for people like us, kept safely separate from it all. I want to live in the pulse hot thick of it, where the nights jive, where the streets hum, amongst people and politics, struggles and upheavals. I'm a dangerous woman, and my time has come. There's a more insistent one that comes from Cheryl Marie Wade. And she catches the public in their shameful binarism. I am not one of the physically challenged. I'm a sock in the eye with a gnarled fist. I'm a French kiss with a cleft tongue. I'm orthopedic shoes sewn on a last of your fears. I am not one of the differently abled. I'm an epitaph for a million imperfect babies left untreated. I'm an icon carved from bones in a mass grave in Tiergarten, Germany. I'm withered legs hidden with a blanket. I am not one of the able disabled. I am a black panther with green eyes and scars like a picket fence. I'm pink lace panties teasing a stub of milk-white thigh. I'm the evil eye, I'm the first cell divided. I'm mud that talks, I'm Eve, I'm Callie. I'm the mountain that never moves. I've been forever, I'll be forever. I'm the gimp, I'm the cripple, I'm the crazy lady, I'm the woman with juice. So she's playing with the public's, I said earlier, shameful binarisms. That sense that a disabled person can't be sexual. So she's juxtaposing an image of white stub, a stub of milk white thigh on pink lace panties. And its job is to create discomfort. And I think works very well. The arts can help this troubled group of academics by helping shift the sensory modalities, or at least the dominant ones. And we heard again from Rebecca and Sumaira, and I'm sorry I've given you so much credit, but, I'm not sorry, I'm delighted to be giving you so much credit, but it was so interesting to hear how assessment could be turned away from the dominance on the visual to show what you have done. And here I'm suggesting that we might help the academic turn away from the dominance of the verbal, which is often the way in which teaching gets delivered. And Lisa Massey has said speech and the barrage of speech acts dominate so much and blur identity to the point that subjects themselves can disappear. And the suggestion here from Barad is that we might use film, and it's said with a Scottish accent, to use speech as an image to help reconfigure our conceptions of materiality, so that they have to shift in order to accommodate speech. But at the same time, we might also disrupt the visual in the way that Rebecca and Sumaira have exemplified. And here is an example from, again, Beckett and his film Catastrophe, which reads, director, how's the skull? Assistant, you've seen it. Director, I forget, say it. So having to reinforce speech again. So for the academic, the resource is not the how-to or 50 tips to teach in higher education, but it's these minor literatures written from the minority perspective, which help to name themselves, name them as marginalised groups, and help to mobilise politically around them. Examples are from James Joyce, difficult to read but worth it, who offers a kind of exhilaration and over-determination. He offers excess of words, repetition, so that you stop and say, what? You're interrupted. Ineluctable modality of the visible. What? Beckett, in contrast, offers dryness and sobriety, a kind of poverty of language, so that again we're interrupted. I can't go on. I must go on. I go on. What? Again, we're interrupted by these minor literatures. And they allow us, in that interrupted moment, to engage in a kind of demonstration, reminding ourselves of demos being about the people, managing the presence of those who don't normally count. And thereby they help us to do a kind of education that is political. The final space is the epiphanic, and again comes from Joyce. And it's a plea to return to the ordinary, to the everyday. James Joyce, cited by one of his biographers, talks about the Epiphany as the sudden revelation of the whatness of a thing, the moment in which the soul of the commonest object seems to us radiant. this is Allan speaking now, the artist, Joyce felt, was charged with such revelations and must look for them, not among the gods, but in men, in casual, unostentatious, even unpleasant moments. So that's an invitation to bring into presence those ordinary things, rather than looking for the big theme, the big topic. And I've just listed a methodology of sorts for getting at those ordinary things. It's a methodology called open space technology, which actually breaks the hierarchies, or tries to break the hierarchies among people, and says, let's start again. So what things, rather than themes, do we need to focus on here? So, to take those three spaces, the ontological, the aesthetic, and the epiphanic, and to play in them, allows us to talk back to power. And this is what we need to do, I think, in relation to disability. It allows us to engage in the kind of fearless critiques that we're lacking a little of special education, of exclusion, of segregation. It allows us to talk back, sometimes just by interrupting, to those forces that are undermining inclusive values. It stops us wasting time with the essentialist trap questions that David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder have said are just stupid. What is disability? And we can get on with, and Kay gave us another phrase again today, and we can get on with thinking from disability. So where does disability take us in the analysis? And this is an argument that Rosemary Garland-Thompson has also made, that disability can actually be used. So not what is disability, but what does disability do, or what can it do? And Rosemary is saying it can help us to displace analyses, complicate analyses through, and Rosemary is suggesting a kind of intellectual intolerance, which I just loved. I just loved, rather. I've just loved today to hear Ella Houston talking it through as the description of her own reflexive journey. And it's really about saying it's all right to have uncertainty. And in fact, it's really, really good to have this kind of dissonance, discomfort, disconnection. And that's where the learning takes place. And just finally, or almost finally, it takes us to a reminder from Hannah Arendt that we have to keep practicing this. We have to keep doing it every single day. So critical work, critical thinking is a path that is paved by its own thinking, and that we get better at it by training in thinking. And it's a path that we have to keep plodding every single day. And I am going to finally stop with a cradle for support, which I think I'm going to leave if we were running short, when we are kind of up against the clock, but I want to do it. It's a cradle for support rather than guidelines for support. And it begins throughout history. People with physical and mental disabilities have been abandoned at birth, banished from society, used as court jesters, drowned and burned in the Inquisition, gassed in Nazi Germany, and still continue to be segregated, institutionalized, tortured in the name of behavior management, abused, raped, euthanized and murdered. I'm saying that with a Scottish accent, murdered. People pay good money to hear you say murdered. In fact, my brother went to England and people used to say, will you just say, my name's Taggart and this is murder? Patronising. Now for the first time, people with disabilities are taking their rightful place as fully contributing citizens. The danger is that we will respond with remediation and benevolence rather than equity and respect. And so we offer you a cradle for support. Do not see my disability as the problem. Recognize that disability is an attribute. Do not see my disability as a deficit. It is you who see me as deviant and helpless. Do not try to fix me, because I'm not broken. Support me. I can make my contribution to the community on my own. Do not see me as your client. I am your fellow citizen. See me as your neighbour. Remember, none of us can be self-sufficient. Do not try to modify my behaviour. Be still and listen. What you define as inappropriate may be my attempt to communicate with you in the only way I can. Do not try to change me. You have no right. Help me learn what I want to know. Do not hide your uncertainty behind professional distance. Be a person who listens and does not take my struggles away from me by trying to make it all better. Do not use theories and strategies on me. Be with me. And when we struggle with each other, let that give rise to self-reflection. Do not try to control me. I have a right to my power as a person. What you call non-compliance or manipulation may actually be the only way I can exert some control over my life. Do not teach me to be obedient, submissive, and polite. I need to feel entitled to say no if I am to protect myself. Do not be charitable towards me. The last thing the world needs is another Jerry Lewis. Be my ally against those who exploit me for their own gratification. Do not try to be my friend. I deserve more than that. Get to know me. We may become friends. Do not help me, even if it does make you feel good. Ask me if I need your help. Let me show you how you can best assist me. Do not admire me. A desire to live a full life does not warrant adoration. Respect me, for respect presumes equity. Do not tell, correct, and lead. Listen, support, and follow. Do not work on me, work with me. And that comes from Norman Cook and Emma Vanderclift. And I want to end with their wonderful words. So thank you.